Get out of my way, Ethan Carter barked, clutching his briefcase as he stepped out of his chauffeured town car onto the crowded Manhattan sidewalk. The morning rush engulfed him in a tide of faces, none of which he cared to acknowledge. He had an investor meeting in less than an hour, and every moment wasted was money lost. But as he pushed through the throng, a small voice pierced the clamor. "Sir, can you spare $1? Please." Ethan turned sharply, his glare falling on a girl sitting on the ground near the corner of 47th and Lexington. Her clothes were tattered, and her face was streaked with dirt, but her gaze was steady. "No," he snapped, moving past her without a second thought. She didn't chase him or plead further, which was unusual. He stopped mid-stride, glancing back. There she was, pulling a threadbare hoodie tighter around her shoulders as if bracing against the cold. Something about her stillness felt out of place. "What's your angle, kid?" he demanded, stepping closer. "No angle," she said flatly. "I'm hungry." Her voice lacked the desperation he expected. Ethan hesitated, scanning her critically. She couldn't have been older than 12, but there was a resilience in her posture. "Go to a shelter," he said dismissively. "They're full," she replied simply, standing up. She was barely taller than his waist, but her presence was strangely commanding. Ethan sighed, checking his watch. "Fine. I'll give you something to eat, but not here. Come with me." The girl's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because I don't carry cash," he said impatiently. "You want food or not?" After a beat, she nodded and followed him. Ethan led her into a nearby cafe, ordering 2 sandwiches and coffee for himself. As they waited, the girl sat silently across from him, unflinching under his scrutiny. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lucy. No last name? Does it matter?" Ethan smirked at her defiance. "Fair enough. How long have you been out here?" "A while." The sandwiches arrived, and Lucy grabbed hers quickly, eating with controlled urgency. Ethan sipped his coffee, watching her closely. She wasn't the usual picture of homelessness he'd encountered, a mess of incoherent begging or erratic behavior. Lucy was sharp, deliberate. As she finished, she stood up abruptly. "Thanks." "Wait," Ethan said, raising a hand. "How old are you?" 12, she said. Ethan frowned. "No family?" Lucy shrugged. "Not anymore." He didn't know why he pressed further. Normally, he'd have walked away by now, but there was something unsettling about her composure. "Do you want to work?" he asked suddenly. Lucy blinked, surprised. "Doing what?" "Cleaning," he said, as though testing the word himself. "My place is cluttered. I'll pay you with food and water. Deal?" Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm late for a meeting, and this conversation is taking too long," Ethan said, standing and tossing a $20 bill onto the table. "Come by tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Here's my address." He scribbled it on a napkin and handed it to her before striding out the door, leaving Lucy standing there, the napkin crumpled in her small fist. Ethan didn't think about her again until the next morning when his doorman buzzed him. "There's a girl here for you," the doorman said hesitantly. Ethan smirked. "Send her up." When Lucy entered his pristine penthouse, she didn't gawk at the towering windows or the glittering skyline. Instead, her eyes scanned the space with cool calculation. "This isn't cluttered," she said bluntly. Ethan chuckled. "Well, it's not clean either. Get to work." Lucy didn't ask for instructions. She found the cleaning supplies in a utility closet and began tidying the sprawling living room. Ethan sat nearby, pretending to read emails but watching her carefully. She moved with precision, her small hands wiping surfaces and rearranging items without hesitation. "You're oddly good at this," he remarked. Lucy shrugged. "I've had practice." The words lingered longer than Ethan expected. Practice? At 12? He wanted to ask more but decided against it. By noon, the living room was spotless. Lucy stood before him, her hands on her hips. "Done. Where's my payment?" Ethan smirked, impressed by her boldness. He handed her a sandwich and a bottle of water from the kitchen. "That's it?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's what we agreed," he said coolly. Lucy didn't argue. She took the food and walked to the elevator. As the doors closed, she glanced back, her expression unreadable. Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the spot where she'd stood. For the first time in years, he felt something strange, an itch, a pull, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on his laptop screen. He had no idea that his simple act of hiring her would soon unravel his carefully controlled world. The next morning, Ethan was already buried in spreadsheets and quarterly reports when the doorman called again. "She's here," came the hesitant voice on the other end. Ethan glanced at his Rolex, surprised. "Send her up." When Lucy stepped into the penthouse, she was holding a small, ragged backpack slung over one shoulder. Her expression was just as composed as the day before, but there was a faint hesitation in her movements, as though she wasn't entirely sure why she had returned. "You're early," Ethan said, closing his laptop and leaning back in his chair. "You didn't say a time," Lucy replied, walking past him to retrieve the cleaning supplies without waiting for instructions. Ethan watched as she began her work, methodically dusting shelves and scrubbing countertops. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Lucy's efficiency was striking, and he found himself oddly fascinated by the quiet rhythm of her movements. "Do you always work this hard?" Ethan asked, breaking the quiet. Lucy shrugged. "If I don't, no one else will." Her words carried a weight that didn't match her age, and Ethan frowned. He decided to push a little further. "You're living on the streets?" Lucy paused, her hand gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "Yeah." "Where exactly?" "Different places," she said, resuming her cleaning as if the question didn't matter. "Ever think about going back to school?" Ethan pressed. She stopped again, turning to face him. "School doesn't feed you." Ethan stared at her, momentarily speechless. There was no bitterness in her tone, just a flat acceptance of reality. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. "Fair point," he muttered, standing to pour himself a cup of coffee. "You know, most kids your age are glued to phones and video games." Lucy let out a short laugh. "Most kids my age have homes." Ethan sipped his coffee, hiding the flicker of unease her words ignited. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, least of all by a 12-year-old. Yet here she was, slicing through his carefully cultivated indifference with every sentence. By the time Lucy finished cleaning, Ethan was ready with another sandwich and bottle of water. She took them without comment, stuffing the sandwich into her backpack for later. "You're not eating now?" Ethan asked. "Saving it," she replied. "In case there's no next time." Ethan frowned but said nothing. Lucy started for the elevator, but before stepping inside, she turned back. "Thanks," she said, her voice softer than before. And then she was gone. That evening, Ethan couldn't concentrate on his work. The memory of Lucy's steady gaze and matter-of-fact responses kept intruding, disrupting his usual focus. He'd seen poverty before, countless faces on the streets of New York blending into a blur of desperation, but Lucy was different. She wasn't begging. She wasn't desperate. She was surviving, and somehow that made it worse. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city skyline. Why had he even hired her? It wasn't like him to care, but something about her lingered, an itch he couldn't quite scratch. The next day, Ethan found himself waiting for her to arrive. When the doorman's call finally came, he felt an unexpected relief. "She's here," the doorman said, his tone more confident this time. Lucy entered with the same small backpack slung over her shoulder, her face unreadable. Without a word, she set to work, tackling the next room on Ethan's unspoken list. This time, he didn't bother pretending to work. Instead, he leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her. "You're not like other kids," he said after a while. Lucy didn't look up. "Good." Ethan smirked. "That wasn't a compliment. Didn't sound like one," she replied, moving to the windows and wiping them with a precision that rivaled his cleaning service. "What happened to your family?" The question came out before he could stop himself. Lucy froze, her rag hovering midair. For a moment, Ethan thought she might snap at him or walk out. But when she turned, her face was calm, though her eyes held a hint of something darker. "They're gone," she said simply. "How? Does it matter?" she asked, her voice sharper now. Ethan held up his hands in mock surrender. "Fair enough." Lucy resumed cleaning, but the tension in the air was palpable. Ethan decided not to press further, but her answer, or lack thereof, only deepened his curiosity. By the end of the week, Lucy had become a regular fixture in Ethan's penthouse. Each day, she arrived promptly, worked diligently, and left with her payment of food and water. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, but her presence had a strange way of disrupting Ethan's carefully ordered life. He found himself asking more questions, testing the boundaries of her guarded nature. And while Lucy rarely offered much in the way of answers, the fragments she did reveal began to form a picture that unsettled him more with each passing day. It wasn't until Friday that Ethan noticed something unusual. Lucy had left her backpack behind, tucked into a corner of the living room. Curious, he approached it, hesitating for a moment before unzipping the top pocket. Inside, he found a crumpled piece of paper, an old newspaper clipping with a faded headline, "Tragedy strikes suburban home, family lost in deadly fire." Ethan's heart sank as he scanned the article. The details were sparse, but the photo was unmistakable. A young girl with wide eyes and a shy smile, standing between a man and woman who could only have been her parents. It was Lucy. Ethan stared at the clipping, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't just another homeless kid. Lucy wasn't just surviving. She was running from a past that had nearly destroyed her. And now, without meaning to, Ethan had stepped right into the middle of it. Ethan sat at his desk, the newspaper clipping laid flat before him. His gaze flicked between the faded photo of Lucy and the article's haunting details. The fire began in the early hours, claiming the lives of William and Margaret Bennett. Their daughter, Lucy, survived by escaping through a second-floor window. Authorities cite negligence in fire safety protocols at the site. Negligence. The word gnawed at Ethan. His company had holdings in numerous ventures, many of which he only skimmed over during quarterly reviews. But deep down, he knew. The connection between his empire and Lucy's tragedy was too plausible to ignore. He closed the clipping and stuffed it back into her bag just as the elevator chimed. Lucy stepped in, her eyes flicking immediately to her backpack. She froze, noticing it had been moved. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice sharp. Ethan raised his hands in a gesture of innocence. "I was tidying up."
Relax.
Lucy snatched the bag and inspected its contents, her movements fast and defensive. Ethan watched as her expression shifted when she saw the clipping in its original place, her shoulders stiffening. "You looked at it," she accused, her voice low. "Yes," Ethan admitted. He didn't see a point in lying. "I needed to understand." Her eyes flared with anger, and she clutched the bag to her chest like it was armor. "You had no right." "You're right," Ethan said, standing. "But now I know what happened. I know about your family." Lucy's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything." "Then tell me," Ethan pressed. "Help me understand why a 12-year-old girl is cleaning my penthouse instead of living a normal life." Lucy turned away, her body trembling. For a moment, Ethan thought she'd storm out. But then she dropped the bag at her feet and faced him. "You want to understand?" she snapped. "Fine. My house burned down. My parents died. And you know why? Because someone cut corners on safety to save a few dollars." Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Lucy, don't," she interrupted. "I don't care what you think. I don't need pity. I don't need anything from you." Ethan took a step closer, his voice steady but softer. "You don't have to do this alone. Let me help." Lucy let out a bitter laugh. "Help? You think giving me sandwiches and letting me scrub your floors is help? You're just another guy looking to feel good about himself." "That's not true," Ethan said, his tone more forceful now. "I didn't know about the fire. If I had, You what?" Lucy shot back. "Would have sent flowers? Paid off the cops? You're all the same. Rich people who fix problems by throwing money at them." Ethan opened his mouth to respond but stopped. She wasn't wrong. His entire life had been built on money, using it to solve problems, silence critics, and avoid accountability. But this wasn't just about him anymore. "I can't change what happened," he said finally, "but I can do better now." Lucy stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of sincerity. For a moment, her guard seemed to waver. Then she shook her head and grabbed her back. "Don't bother," she said. "People like you don't change." She headed for the elevator, and Ethan didn't stop her this time. The doors closed, leaving him alone in the cavernous silence of his penthouse. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Lucy's words replayed in his mind, cutting deeper with each repetition. "People like you don't change." He poured himself a scotch and sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Lucy was likely curled up on a bench or in an alley, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. The thought made him feel something he hadn't felt in years: helplessness. He couldn't let it end like this. Lucy had been right about a lot of things, but she was wrong about one. He could change, and he would prove it. The next morning, Ethan made calls. He dug through old company records, piecing together the chain of decisions that led to the fire. The deeper he went, the uglier it became. Cost-cutting measures, ignored safety recommendations, rushed construction schedules. It all pointed back to one of his subsidiaries. By noon, he had the name of the executive who had signed off on the project: Robert Hargrove, a man Ethan had trusted for years. A man who had quietly retired with a generous severance package just months after the fire. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. It wasn't enough to know the truth. He had to act on it. That evening, Lucy didn't show up. Ethan wasn't surprised, but it didn't stop the pang of disappointment when the doorman confirmed she hadn't been seen. Instead of waiting, Ethan went looking for her. He wandered the streets near his building, scanning every corner and alley. It wasn't until he reached a small park 3 blocks away that he found her, sitting on a bench with her knees drawn to her chest. "Lucy," he called out, approaching slowly. She glanced up, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" "To talk," he said, stopping a few feet away. "And to apologize." She rolled her eyes. "You already said sorry." "Not for looking at the clipping," Ethan said. "For what my company did. For what I allowed to happen." Lucy's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Ethan sat on the bench beside her, keeping his distance. "The fire wasn't random. It happened because people like me put profit over safety, and I'm going to make it right." Lucy didn't respond at first, her eyes fixed on the ground. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "You can't bring them back." "I know," Ethan said, "but I can try to make sure it doesn't happen again, and I can help you." Lucy looked at him then, her expression unreadable. For the first time, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something other than anger in her eyes, something like hope. "Why?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, then spoke the truth. "Because I need to." Lucy said nothing, but she didn't walk away either. For now, that was enough. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. Lucy began returning to Ethan's penthouse, but the tension between them lingered like a fragile thread. She worked quietly, keeping her distance, while Ethan struggled to find the right words to bridge the growing chasm between them. "You don't have to keep cleaning," Ethan said one morning as Lucy scrubbed the windows of his study. Lucy didn't turn around. "I don't take handouts," Ethan sighed, setting his coffee cup down. "It's not a handout. I'm offering to help you in other ways." "I didn't ask for help," she said, her voice sharp. "I asked for work." The silence that followed was heavy. Ethan wanted to argue, but he knew better. Lucy's independence was her shield, and any attempt to dismantle it would only push her further away. Instead, he decided to focus on what he could control. By the end of the week, Ethan had launched an internal investigation into the construction company responsible for the fire. As he suspected, corners had been cut to maximize profits, with safety regulations blatantly ignored. The evidence was damning, and it painted a clear picture of systemic negligence. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the report in front of him. His stomach churned as he read through the details. Faulty wiring, substandard materials, insufficient inspections. Each line felt like a personal indictment. He picked up his phone and called Robert Hargrove. "Robert," Ethan began, his tone cold. "We need to talk." That evening, Lucy arrived at the penthouse to find Ethan pacing the living room. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "You're early," she said, dropping her backpack by the door. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice firm. Lucy hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "About what?" "The fire," he said, "and what I've been doing to fix it." Lucy crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Why do you keep bringing this up? It's done. It happened. Nothing you do changes that." "You're right," Ethan said, stepping closer. "But it's not just about the past. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again." Lucy frowned, her posture stiffening. "What are you talking about?" Ethan gestured for her to sit, but she stayed where she was. Undeterred, he continued. "The fire that took your family wasn't an accident. It was negligence. People cutting costs and ignoring safety to save money. People like me," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. Lucy's expression darkened. You're saying you're responsible? I'm saying my company is, Ethan clarified, and that I've allowed things like this to happen for too long without questioning them. For the first time, Lucy seemed genuinely taken aback. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know the truth, Ethan said. And because I want to make things right. Lucy's eyes searched his face, her guarded demeanor slipping just slightly. How? Ethan took a deep breath. I've already started an investigation into the company responsible. Heads are going to roll. Policies will change. And I'm setting up a fund to support families affected by tragedies like yours. Lucy's jaw tightened. You think money fixes everything? No, Ethan admitted, but it's a start. And it's better than doing nothing. Lucy was silent for a long moment, her gaze dropping to the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Why do you care so much? I'm just some kid to you. Ethan hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Because I've spent my whole life looking the other way. And meeting you made me realize how much damage that's caused. You're not just some kid, Lucy. You're proof that I can be better. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, filled with a mix of skepticism and something else, something softer. I don't trust you, she said bluntly. I don't expect you to, Ethan replied. But I'm going to prove it anyway. The next morning, Ethan held a press conference to announce the findings of his investigation. The media swarmed as he stood at the podium, his tailored suit impeccable but his expression grim. My name is Ethan Carter, he began, his voice steady, and I'm here to take responsibility for the mistakes my company has made. He detailed the negligence that led to the fire, sparing no detail. He announced a multi-million-dollar fund to support victims and pledged sweeping reforms across his business. The room buzzed with questions, but Ethan held his ground, answering each one with unflinching honesty. Watching the broadcast from the corner of the penthouse, Lucy sat cross-legged on the couch, her expression unreadable. When the camera panned to show the faces of reporters, she could see the mix of shock and respect in their eyes. Ethan had taken the first step, but Lucy knew it wouldn't be enough. Not yet. When Ethan returned that evening, Lucy was waiting for him. So, she said, arms crossed, what now? Ethan set his briefcase down and met her gaze. Now we keep going. One step at a time. Lucy studied him for a moment before nodding. All right, she said, but I'm not letting you off the hook that easily. Ethan smirked, a flicker of amusement breaking through his exhaustion. I wouldn't expect anything less. For the first time, their alliance felt less like a reluctant truce and more like a partnership. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear. Neither of them was walking it alone anymore. Lucy showed up the next morning earlier than usual, her backpack slung tightly over her shoulder. Ethan was in the kitchen, making himself an espresso, when the doorman buzzed to announce her arrival. She's already here? Ethan muttered, surprised, before pressing the button to let her up. When Lucy stepped into the penthouse, her sharp gaze swept the room as if searching for something. Ethan noticed the way her fingers toyed with the strap of her bag, a small sign of unease. You're early, Ethan said, trying to sound casual as he leaned against the counter. Didn't expect to see you until later. Lucy shrugged, dropping her bag onto the floor. Figured I'd get started. Ethan wasn't convinced. Something was on her mind, but he decided not to push, at least not yet. Fine, he said, gesturing toward the dining room. That table's a mess. See what you can do. Lucy nodded and got to work, scrubbing and reorganizing as she always did. Ethan sat nearby, pretending to go through emails but watching her out of the corner of his eye. She moved with her usual precision, but there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. After nearly an hour of silence, Lucy finally spoke. That press conference yesterday, was it for real? Ethan set down his phone, surprised. Of course it was. Lucy didn't stop working, her voice flat. People like you don't usually admit when they're wrong. Ethan frowned. People like me? You know. She glanced at him, her expression guarded. Rich people, powerful people. You're good at covering things up, not owning them. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You think I did it for show? Lucy straightened and faced him, her cleaning rag hanging loosely in her hand. I think you're not used to feeling guilty, and you don't know what to do about it. Her words hit harder than he cared to admit. Ethan took a breath, choosing his response carefully. Maybe you're right. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've ignored a lot of problems because it was easier. But I'm trying to fix that now. Why now? Lucy pressed, her tone skeptical. Why not before the fire? Or the hundreds of other things your company's probably messed up? Ethan opened his mouth to respond but stopped. She deserved an honest answer, not a polished excuse. He rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze dropping to the floor. Because I didn't care, he admitted quietly. Not until I met you. Lucy blinked, visibly taken aback by his candor. She looked away, her grip tightening on the rag. I don't need you to care about me. Maybe not, Ethan said. But I do. The room fell silent. Lucy stared at the floor, her expression unreadable. Ethan didn't press her further, sensing that she needed time to process his words. Later that afternoon, Lucy finished cleaning and headed toward the elevator. Ethan walked her to the door, leaning against the frame as she hit the button for the lobby. Do you ever let people in? He asked suddenly. Lucy froze, her hand hovering over the elevator buttons. She turned to him, her brow furrowing. What? You keep everyone at arm's length, Ethan said, his tone gentle. Why? Lucy hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. Because people leave, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Or they let you down. Either way, it's easier not to need anyone. Ethan nodded slowly, his chest tightening at her words. That's no way to live, Lucy. It's the only way I know, she replied, stepping into the elevator. The doors closed before Ethan could respond. That evening, Ethan sat in his office, staring at the city skyline. Lucy's words replayed in his mind, each one hitting with the force of a hammer. He had spent years building walls around himself, not unlike Lucy's. But the difference was that his walls had been built out of greed and apathy, while hers had been built for survival. He picked up his phone and made another call, this one to his legal team. I want everything related to the Bennett fire review. Every report, every contract, every decision. And I want it fast. The line crackled with the voice of his lead attorney, surprised but compliant. Yes, Mr. Carter. I'll get on it. Ethan hung up, his jaw tightening. He wasn't just going to fix this mess for Lucy's sake. He was going to tear it down, brick by brick, until there was nothing left of the corruption that had taken her family from her. The next morning, Lucy arrived at the penthouse to find Ethan already waiting. He stood by the windows, a cup of coffee in his hand, his expression serious. Morning, she said, her tone neutral. We need to talk, Ethan said, setting his cup down. I found more details about the fire. Lucy stiffened, her bag slipping from her shoulder. What details? Ethan gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her arms crossed. He sighed and pressed on. The fire wasn't just negligence, he said. It was covered up. Reports were altered. Inspections were falsified. The people responsible, people in my company, made sure no one took the blame. Lucy's eyes narrowed. And you're only telling me this now? I didn't know until yesterday, Ethan said, his voice firm. But now that I do, I'm not letting it slide. What does that even mean? She asked, her tone laced with skepticism. It means, Ethan said, stepping closer, that I'm going after the people who did this. And I want you to be part of it. Lucy stared at him, her expression unreadable. Why would I want to be part of anything you're doing? Because this is your fight too, Ethan said. And because I can't do it alone. For a long moment, Lucy didn't respond. She looked out the window, her fingers twitching at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. I'll think about it, she said. Ethan nodded, a flicker of hope lighting his chest. That's all I ask. Lucy grabbed her backpack and headed for the elevator, her steps slow and deliberate. As the doors closed behind her, Ethan felt the weight of her decision hanging in the air. For the first time, it felt like they were finally moving forward, together. The next morning, Lucy stood in the lobby of Ethan's building, staring at the elevator doors. Her mind swirled with doubt, but she tightened her grip on the straps of her backpack. She didn't trust Ethan, not fully, but something in his voice yesterday had struck a chord. He wasn't just offering empty promises. He was angry, determined, and, for reasons she couldn't fully understand, willing to bring her into the fight. When she arrived at the penthouse, Ethan was seated at the dining table, a laptop open and papers scattered around him. He looked up as the elevator doors opened, his expression brightening slightly. "Morning," he said, closing the laptop. "Glad you came." Lucy crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. "I'm not here to clean today." "Good," Ethan replied, standing. "Because we've got work to do." She raised an eyebrow. "Work? What kind of work?" Ethan gestured toward the table. "Research. Calls. Anything that helps us dig deeper into what happened and who was involved." Lucy hesitated. "You really think they're just going to let you dig into this without pushing back?" Ethan smirked, a sharp edge to his expression. "They can try, but I'm not exactly easy to intimidate." Lucy stepped closer, her gaze sweeping over the documents on the table. "Where do we start?" Ethan handed Lucy a file labeled Internal Correspondence, Hargrove, and explained. Robert Hargrove was the executive in charge of the project. He retired shortly after the fire, which is suspicious timing. "I want to know why." Lucy flipped through the pages, scanning the emails and memos. "These look like normal business emails," she said. "What are we looking for?" "Anything that seems off," Ethan said. "Unusual phrasing, last-minute changes, things like that." They worked in silence for the next hour, Lucy sorting through stacks of papers while Ethan focused on his laptop. Every now and then, Lucy would glance at him, watching the way his jaw tightened when he read something particularly damning. She was beginning to see that his determination wasn't just for show. He really cared about uncovering the truth. "I found something," Lucy said suddenly, holding up a sheet of paper. Ethan looked up, moving closer. "What is it?" "It's an email," Lucy explained. "Hargrove wrote it to one of the contractors a week before the fire. He says, 'We can't afford to miss deadlines. Do what's necessary to keep the project moving.'" That doesn't sound like safety was a priority. Ethan frowned, taking the paper from her. "You're right. It's vague, but it's definitely a red flag." He added the email to a growing pile of evidence. "Good catch." Lucy shrugged, but Ethan didn't miss the flicker of pride in her expression. She wasn't used to being acknowledged for her skills, and he made a mental note to do it more often. By midday, the tension between them had eased. Lucy had warmed to the task, her sharp eyes catching details Ethan might have overlooked. In return, he found himself impressed by her focus and insight. Despite her age, she was remarkably adept at connecting dots and asking the right questions. "You're good at this," Ethan said as they took a break for lunch. Lucy poked at the sandwich he'd handed her. "Surviving on the streets teaches you to notice things. If you don't, you miss opportunities or warnings." Ethan nodded, his expression somber. "It's a skill, but one you shouldn't have needed to learn." Lucy didn't respond, instead taking a bite of her sandwich. She didn't want his pity, but there was something comforting in the way he acknowledged her reality without making it a spectacle. That afternoon, Ethan made the first of many calls. Lucy listened from across the room as he spoke with lawyers, investigators, and journalists, his tone shifting effortlessly between firm and persuasive. He was leveraging his wealth and influence to dismantle the very systems that had protected people like Hargrove. When Ethan hung up, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "This isn't going to be quick," he said. "People like Hargrove know how to cover their tracks, but we've got enough here to make them nervous." Lucy nodded, her expression unreadable. "What happens when they push back?" Ethan smirked. "Let them. I'm ready for a fight." For the first time, Lucy allowed herself a small smile. She still didn't fully trust Ethan, but she couldn't deny his resolve. Maybe, just maybe, he was serious about making things right. As the sun set, Lucy packed her bag and headed for the elevator. Ethan walked her to the door, his hands in his pockets. "You did good today," he said. "I mean it." Lucy paused, her fingers hovering over the elevator button. "Don't thank me yet. We're not even close to done." Ethan chuckled. "Fair point. But still, you're part of this now. And I'm glad you are." She glanced at him, her expression softening for just a moment. "We'll see." The elevator doors closed, and Ethan stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where she'd been. Despite the challenges ahead, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He returned to the table, staring down at the files and papers scattered across it. The fight was only beginning, but for the first time, he wasn't fighting alone. 2 days later, Ethan's phone buzzed as he stepped out of a board meeting. The number was unfamiliar, but his gut told him to answer. "This is Ethan Carter. You need to stop digging," a cold voice said, without preamble. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who is this?" "You know who we are," the voice replied. "Drop the investigation. Focus on your business, not ancient history." The line went dead before Ethan could respond. He stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, a wave of cold fury washing over him. The threat was vague, but the message was clear. His investigation was ruffling feathers. Ethan didn't flinch. If anything, the call strengthened his resolve. He walked briskly to his office, dialing his legal team on the way. "Get everything we have on Robert Hargrove," he ordered. "I want a full timeline of his involvement, from the day the project started to the day he retired. No gaps." When Lucy arrived at the penthouse later that afternoon, Ethan's mood was sharp, his focus razor-edged. She could sense the tension as soon as she stepped off the elevator. "What happened?" she asked, dropping her backpack on the couch. Ethan looked up from his laptop, his expression grim. "We've made people nervous. I got a warning this morning. Anonymous, of course." Lucy's brows furrowed. "What kind of warning?" "The back off or else kind," Ethan said. "They're trying to scare me into dropping the investigation." Lucy crossed her arms, leaning against the edge of the counter. "Are you?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Do I seem like the type to back down?" "No," she admitted, a small smirk tugging at her lips. "You seem like the type to make them regret calling." "Exactly," Ethan said, standing and grabbing a folder from the table. "But it means we need to be more careful. The people we're dealing with aren't just careless. They're dangerous." Lucy's smirk faded, her posture stiffening. "So what do we do?" Ethan handed her the folder. "We keep digging. The more we know, the harder it'll be for them to stop us." For the next several hours, Lucy and Ethan combed through documents and emails, piecing together the puzzle. Every lead they uncovered seemed to point to Hargrove, but Ethan suspected he wasn't acting alone. Someone higher up had approved the decisions that led to the fire, and Ethan was determined to find out who. "Look at this," Lucy said, holding up an invoice. "This contractor charged half of what the others did. That's not normal, right?" Ethan frowned, taking the paper from her. "No, it's not. It means they were cutting costs somewhere." He cross-referenced the invoice with other documents, his eyes narrowing. "And they were the ones responsible for installing the wiring. That explains the faulty circuits." Lucy's hands tightened into fists. "So they hired the cheapest people they could find, knowing it wasn't safe?" "Looks that way," Ethan said grimly. "And Hargrove signed off on it." Lucy's face hardened, her voice trembling with anger. They knew, and they did it anyway." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "We're going to make them pay for it. I promise you." The following day, Ethan received a package at his office. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for 3 words scrawled in the center. "This is war." Ethan felt his stomach churn, but he refused to let fear take hold. He called Lucy immediately. "They're escalating," he said as soon as she picked up. "What do you mean?" Lucy asked. "They sent me a message, literally. They're making it clear that they won't go down quietly." Lucy's voice was quiet but firm. "Then neither will we." Her words filled Ethan with a renewed sense of determination. They weren't just uncovering a tragedy, they were dismantling a system that thrived on greed and impunity. And despite her age, Lucy was proving to be one of the strongest allies he'd ever had. That evening, Ethan met with his head of security to review the situation. "Do we need to worry about physical threats?" Ethan asked. "Not yet," the security chief replied, "but it's smart to be cautious. I'll assign additional personnel to your building and monitor your movements." Same for the girl. Ethan hesitated. Lucy doesn't like being followed. She's used to watching her own back. The security chief gave him a stern look. "With all due respect, sir, she's just a kid. If they see her as a weak link, they'll exploit it." Ethan exhaled slowly, nodding. "Fine. Just don't make it obvious. She'll shut down if she feels cornered." When Lucy arrived the next morning, Ethan told her about the increased security. She bristled at first, her independence flaring, but eventually she relented. "Fine," she said. "But if they try anything, I'll deal with it myself." Ethan smirked. "I don't doubt that." As they returned to their work, the weight of their task hung heavily between them. They were poking a bear, and the consequences could be severe. But neither of them was willing to back down. For Lucy, it was personal, a chance to bring justice to the people who had taken everything from her. For Ethan, it was redemption, a way to atone for years of indifference and complicity. And for both of them, it was a fight worth winning. Ethan's office was unusually quiet the next morning as he sat reviewing the latest batch of documents his team had uncovered. The further they dug, the clearer it became that Hargrove hadn't acted alone. The decisions that led to the fire weren't just the result of one man's negligence. They were systemic, woven into the fabric of the company itself. Lucy arrived mid-morning, her face set in a determined expression. She didn't even glance at the coffee Ethan had left for her on the counter, instead heading straight for the table piled with files and folders. "Anything new?" she asked, pulling out a chair. Ethan slid a stack of papers toward her. "We're starting to connect the dots. Hargrove didn't work in isolation. Someone higher up signed off on everything he did." Lucy scanned the documents, her brow furrowing. "So who is it?" "That's what we're about to find out," Ethan said, opening his laptop. "I've got a meeting with someone who used to work in our legal department. They're willing to talk, off the record." Lucy looked up, her interest piqued. "What do they know?" "They handled compliance for the project," Ethan explained. "If anyone knows where the skeletons are buried, it's them." Lucy leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "And you trust them?" Ethan smirked. "Not even a little. But I don't need to trust them to get the information I want." The meeting took place in a quiet cafe on the Upper West Side, far from Ethan's usual haunts. Lucy insisted on tagging along, but Ethan convinced her to stay outside, her presence subtle but reassuring. He entered the cafe alone, spotting the former compliance officer, a wiry man named Alan Ford, seated at a corner table. "Alan," Ethan said as he approached, extending a hand. Alan shook it reluctantly, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Carter, didn't expect to hear from you after all these years." Ethan sat down, cutting straight to the point. "I need answers about the Bennett fire." Alan stiffened, his gaze dropping to the table. "I can't talk about that." "You can and you will," Ethan said firmly. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure you're subpoenaed when this goes to court. And trust me, you don't want to be on the wrong side of this." Alan sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You have no idea what you're up against." "Try me," Ethan said, leaning forward. Alan hesitated, then began speaking in a low voice. "The project was a disaster from the start. Hargrove was under pressure to deliver on time, no matter the cost. Every corner he cut, every regulation he ignored, it was all sanctioned by the higher-ups." "Names," Ethan pressed. Alan glanced around again, then leaned closer. "Frank Whitaker. He was the CFO at the time. He approved every cost-cutting measure, knowing full well what it meant. And he wasn't alone." Ethan's stomach tightened. Whitaker had been a fixture in the company for years, a man known for his ruthless efficiency. If he was involved, this went deeper than Ethan had imagined. "What about the cover-up?" Ethan asked. Alan's expression darkened. "That was Whitaker's doing too. He buried the reports, paid off inspectors, made it all disappear. Hargrove was just the fall guy." Ethan sat back, his mind racing. Whitaker had been untouchable for years, shielded by layers of bureaucracy and loyal allies. But now, Ethan had a name, a target. When Ethan stepped out of the cafe, Lucy was waiting for him on a nearby bench. She stood as he approached, her expression questioning. "Well?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He gestured for her to follow him as they walked down the quiet street. "Frank Whitaker," he said finally. "He's the one who orchestrated everything." Lucy frowned. "And what are you going to do about it?" "Expose him," Ethan said simply. "But it won't be easy. He's got years of experience covering his tracks." Lucy stopped walking, forcing Ethan to turn and face her. "What if he comes after you? After us?" Ethan's expression softened. "Then we push back harder. I'm not letting him get away with this, Lucy. Not after everything he's done." Her eyes searched his face for a moment before she nodded, her resolve hardening. "Okay, let's do it." That evening, Ethan and Lucy worked late into the night, assembling everything they had on Whitaker. Emails, invoices, internal memos. Every piece of evidence pointed to his involvement, but they needed more. To bring him down, they needed something undeniable, something even his lawyers couldn't spin. Lucy leaned over the table, her brow furrowed as she flipped through a stack of documents. "What about these expense reports?" she asked. "They're from a month after the fire. Why would he be funneling money to a private account?" Ethan peered over her shoulder, his interest piqued. "Good question. Let's find out." He pulled up his laptop, typing quickly. Within minutes, he traced the account to a shell company, one that had been used to pay off inspectors after the fire. It was exactly the kind of smoking gun they needed. "Lucy," Ethan said, his voice tinged with excitement. "This is it. This is how we bring him down." Lucy looked at him, her eyes shining with determination. "Then let's do it." The next step was clear. They had to go public. Ethan contacted a trusted journalist, someone with a reputation for taking on powerful figures. Together, they planned to release the story, ensuring that Whitaker couldn't bury it. But as they prepared to take the fight to the next level, Ethan knew the stakes were higher than ever. Whitaker wouldn't go down without a fight, and neither would the system that had protected him for so long. For Ethan and Lucy, this was no longer just about justice. It was about survival, and they were ready for whatever came next. The article hit the newsstands the following morning. The headline was bold, splashed across the front page of the New York Sentinel: "Corporate Greed and the Fire That Killed a Family. Whistleblower Speaks Out." Ethan's name was mentioned prominently as the source of the internal documents, and Frank Whitaker was exposed as the mastermind behind the cost-cutting measures that led to the Bennett fire. Lucy sat on the couch in Ethan's penthouse, the newspaper clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes scanned the article again and again, her emotions a whirlwind of vindication and apprehension. "They know now," she said quietly, looking up at Ethan, who stood by the window, phone in hand. "They know," Ethan agreed, his expression grim. "And Whitaker's not going to take this lying down." As if on cue, Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. "Speak of the devil," he muttered before answering. "Whitaker." The voice on the other end was as cold and composed as Ethan expected. "You've made a grave mistake, Carter. I think exposing you was the best decision I've ever made," Ethan replied coolly, pacing across the room. Whitaker's tone remained icy. "You think you're untouchable? That your little crusade makes you immune? You have no idea what you've unleashed." Ethan smirked, though his grip on the phone tightened. "I'll take my chances." Whitaker's laugh was low and menacing. "This isn't over, Carter. Not by a long shot." The line went dead, and Ethan lowered the phone, exhaling slowly. Lucy watched him, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "What did he say?" she asked. "Exactly what I expected," Ethan replied, tossing the phone onto the counter. "He's angry and desperate." "Desperate people do stupid things," Lucy said, crossing her arms. "What's his next move?" Ethan looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Whatever it is, we'll be ready." The backlash began almost immediately. By noon, Whitaker's legal team had issued a statement, calling the article an unfounded attack on an upstanding corporate leader. The statement accused Ethan of fabricating evidence and acting out of personal vendettas. Social media exploded with opinions, some praising Ethan's courage and others questioning his motives. The phone calls and emails flooded in. Ethan's team worked tirelessly to manage the fallout, but the pressure was mounting. Lucy stayed close, her presence a quiet anchor. Despite her young age, she seemed to understand the gravity of the situation better than most of Ethan's staff. "You okay?" she asked that evening as Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter, rubbing his temples. "I've been better," he admitted, his voice weary. "But I knew this wasn't going to be easy." Lucy hesitated before speaking. "You didn't have to do this. For me. For anyone." Ethan looked at her, his expression softening. "Yes, I did. And not just for you. For everyone who's been hurt by people like Whitaker. This is bigger than both of us." Lucy nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "Then let's make sure we win." 2 days later, a summons arrived at Ethan's office. Whitaker was suing him for defamation, claiming millions in damages. Ethan's lawyers were unsurprised but cautious. "This is a classic intimidation tactic," his lead attorney explained during an emergency meeting. "He's trying to scare you into silence. The evidence we have is strong, but we'll need to be strategic." Ethan nodded, his resolve unshaken. "Do whatever it takes. I'm not backing down." Meanwhile, Lucy found herself grappling with her own emotions. The attention the article had brought was both empowering and overwhelming. For the first time since the fire, her family's story was being acknowledged. But it also dredged up painful memories she'd spent years trying to suppress. One afternoon, as Ethan worked with his legal team, Lucy wandered into the study, her mind racing. She pulled out her backpack, retrieving the old newspaper clipping she'd carried for so long. She stared at the faces of her parents, the pain in her chest as sharp as ever. "Lucy," she looked up to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression concerned. He stepped inside, glancing at the clipping in her hands. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Lucy hesitated before answering. "I thought seeing their story out there would make me feel better. Like justice was finally happening. But it doesn't bring them back." Ethan sat down beside her, his tone soft. "No, it doesn't. But it does make sure their story matters. That what happened to them won't happen to someone else." Lucy nodded, her grip on the clipping tightening. "I just miss them." "I know," Ethan said quietly, "and it's okay to feel that." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Then Lucy looked at Ethan, her eyes steady. "Promise me we'll finish this," she said. "No matter what." Ethan met her gaze, his voice firm. "I promise." As the legal battle with Whitaker loomed, Ethan and Lucy continued their work, gathering more evidence and preparing for the fight ahead. They knew the road would be long and fraught with obstacles, but they also knew they weren't alone. The first strike had been made, and while Whitaker's retaliation was swift, Ethan and Lucy refused to back down. Together, they were determined to see this fight through to the end, no matter the cost. The lawsuit dominated headlines for weeks. Ethan found himself in the center of a media storm, with reporters camping outside his office and his penthouse, shouting questions every time he stepped outside. He handled it with the practiced ease of a corporate veteran, but Lucy could see the wear it was taking on him. "You're not sleeping," she said one evening as they sat in the penthouse dining room, papers spread out between them. "I'll sleep when this is over," Ethan replied, not looking up from the legal brief he was reviewing. Lucy frowned. "You can't fight if you burn out." Ethan glanced at her, a flicker of amusement breaking through his exhaustion. "Didn't realize I'd hired a life coach." Lucy smirked. "You didn't, but you're stuck with me anyway." Despite the mounting pressure, progress was being made. Ethan's legal team uncovered more damning evidence linking Whitaker to the cover-up, including emails explicitly instructing subordinates to falsify safety inspection reports. The evidence was solid enough to turn the tide in their favor, but Whitaker's lawyers were relentless, filing motions to dismiss and accusing Ethan of tampering. The strain wasn't just legal, it was personal. One afternoon, Ethan's security team intercepted a letter mailed to his office. Inside was a photo of Lucy sitting on a park bench, clearly taken without her knowledge. Scrawled across the bottom were the words, "She's not safe." Ethan's blood ran cold. He immediately called Lucy, who was out running errands. "Where are you?" he demanded, his voice tight. "Near the library," she replied, confused. "Why? Stay there. I'm sending a car. Don't move." When Lucy arrived back at the penthouse, Ethan showed her the photo. Her face went pale, but she squared her shoulders, refusing to let fear take over. "They're trying to scare us," she said. "It's not going to work." Ethan admired her bravery, but felt a deep sense of guilt. He had brought her into this fight, and now she was a target. "We're increasing security," he said. "Everywhere you go." Lucy crossed her arms. "I don't want to be followed." "It's not up for debate," Ethan said firmly. "You're too important to me." "To this." Lucy hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. But if they're trying to scare us, it means we're winning." The tension reached a boiling point during a pretrial hearing. Whitaker's lawyers argued that the evidence Ethan had presented was inadmissible, citing procedural issues. Ethan's legal team countered with a detailed rebuttal, but the judge delayed ruling, giving Whitaker's team more time to strategize. After the hearing, Ethan and Lucy sat in a small conference room with his lawyers. The mood was tense, the weight of the delay pressing on everyone. "This is how they work," Ethan's lead attorney, Angela, said. "They stall, hoping to wear us down." "They won't," Ethan said firmly. "We'll keep pushing." Angela nodded, but looked skeptical. "It's not just the court we have to worry about. The public perception is shifting. Whitaker's team is painting this as a personal vendetta. We need to counter that. Ethan glanced at Lucy, an idea forming. What if Lucy told her story publicly? Lucy blinked, startled. What? No, I'm not. I can't do that. You can, Ethan said gently. And you don't have to. But your voice is powerful, Lucy. People need to see who this fight is really about. Lucy looked down at her hands, her mind racing. The idea terrified her, but part of her knew Ethan was right. She had spent years running from her past, hiding in the shadows. Maybe it was time to step into the light. I'll think about it, she said finally. That night, Ethan found Lucy sitting by the window, staring out at the city. He approached quietly, taking a seat beside her. I didn't mean to pressure you, he said. This is your choice. Lucy nodded, her gaze distant. I know. It's just, if I do this, there's no going back. Everyone will know who I am. They'll know your strength, Ethan said, and your courage. Lucy glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. You're good at this motivational stuff. Comes with the territory, Ethan said with a chuckle. But seriously, whatever you decide, I'm with you. Lucy looked back out at the city, her mind made up. I'll do it. Ethan felt a swell of pride, but kept his tone steady. Are you sure? Yeah, she said. It's time. The next day, Ethan arranged for Lucy to sit down with a trusted journalist for an exclusive interview. As the cameras rolled, Lucy spoke openly about the fire, her family, and the years she had spent surviving on the streets. Her voice trembled at times, but she didn't shy away from the truth. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. When the interview aired, it sparked a wave of public outrage. Support for Ethan and Lucy surged, with thousands calling for Whitaker to be held accountable. For the first time, the tide seemed to be turning in their favor, but Whitaker wasn't finished. As the pressure mounted, he prepared to launch a counterattack that would test Ethan and Lucy's resolve like never before. The cost of their fight was growing, and the stakes had never been higher. The interview changed everything. Lucy's story resonated with millions, putting a human face on the devastation caused by Whitaker's actions. Support flooded in from unexpected places: activists, politicians, and everyday people outraged by the revelations. Ethan's inbox overflowed with messages of encouragement, and donations to victims' advocacy groups skyrocketed. But for all the progress they'd made, Whitaker's response was swift and ruthless. Within days, a smear campaign targeting both Ethan and Lucy began to spread like wildfire across social media and news outlets. The first blow came in the form of a leaked document, purportedly showing that Ethan had knowingly approved the cost-cutting measures years ago. The story accused him of shifting blame onto Whitaker to save his own reputation. This is nonsense, Ethan growled, tossing the newspaper onto his desk. That document's been doctored. Angela, his attorney, nodded grimly. We're already working to disprove it, but the damage is done. People are questioning your motives. Ethan exhaled sharply, his frustration mounting. And Lucy? Angela hesitated. They're attacking her too, claiming the interview was staged, that she's being used as a pawn. Ethan's fists clenched. She's a kid. They're dragging her into this to protect themselves. It's despicable, Angela agreed. But it means you're hitting a nerve. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. Then we keep hitting. Lucy had been scrolling through her phone when she saw the first headline. Corporate puppet or victim? The truth about Lucy Bennett. Her stomach turned as she read the accusations. The article suggested that she was being manipulated by Ethan, her tragic story exploited for his benefit. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. Lucy, Ethan called from the next room. She marched into his office, holding up her phone. Did you see this? Ethan looked up, his expression dark. I did. They're saying I'm lying, she said, her voice trembling with anger. That you're using me. They're scared, Ethan said, standing. This is how they fight back, by trying to discredit us. But people will believe it, Lucy exclaimed. What if they're right? What if I'm just making things worse? Ethan stepped closer, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Look at me, Lucy. You're not making things worse. You're the reason we've gotten this far. They're attacking you because they know you're a threat. Lucy's eyes glistened, but she nodded, taking a deep breath. So what do? We keep going, Ethan said firmly. We fight back with the truth. Over the next week, Ethan's team worked tirelessly to counter Whitaker's smear campaign. They released emails proving that Ethan had not been involved in the fire's cost-cutting decisions, backed by statements from former employees. Lucy's school records, showing her abrupt withdrawal following the fire, were shared to reinforce her credibility. Despite their efforts, the pressure continued to mount. Protesters began gathering outside Ethan's office, some holding signs demanding justice for the victims, others accusing him of complicity. The conflicting narratives only fueled the media frenzy. Late one night, as Ethan and Lucy reviewed their progress, the tension in the room was palpable. Lucy sat cross-legged on the couch, flipping through news articles, while Ethan paced back and forth. "They're not letting up," Lucy said, scrolling through another inflammatory headline. "Neither are we," Ethan replied, though his exhaustion was evident. Lucy set her phone down, watching him. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan stopped, turning to her. "What do you mean?" "This fight," Lucy said. "You've got money, power. You could walk away and be fine. So why keep pushing?" Ethan hesitated, then sat across from her. "Because I have to. I've spent years looking the other way, pretending things like this didn't matter. But they do. You matter." Lucy's eyes softened, but she quickly looked away. "It just feels too big. Like we're never going to win." Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. "The bigger the fight, the more important it is to keep going. We might not win every battle, but if we don't try, we lose everything." Lucy nodded slowly, his words sinking in. "Okay, let's keep going." The turning point came unexpectedly. A whistleblower from Whitaker's inner circle contacted Ethan's team, offering evidence of additional corruption within the company. The documents revealed a pattern of illegal activities spanning years, implicating Whitaker and several high-ranking executives. "This is it," Angela said during an emergency meeting. "This isn't just about the fire anymore. This could bring the whole house of cards down." Ethan's eyes flicked to Lucy, who sat quietly at the end of the table. "What do you think?" he asked. Lucy looked up, her gaze steady. "I think it's time to finish this." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then that's what we'll do." With the new evidence in hand, Ethan and Lucy prepared for the fight of their lives. The stakes had never been higher, but they were ready. Whitaker had underestimated them, and now his empire was on the verge of collapse. As the final battle loomed, one thing was certain: they wouldn't stop until justice was served. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, advocates, and onlookers filled the seats, all eager to witness the culmination of a battle that had gripped the nation. At the center of it all were Ethan Carter and Lucy Bennett, the unlikely duo who had taken on a corporate titan. Frank Whitaker sat at the defense table, his expression cold and impassive. To his left was his high-powered legal team, their every movement calculated and deliberate. Ethan sat opposite him, his jaw set, his lawyers flanking him. Lucy sat quietly beside him, her presence a reminder of everything they were fighting for. The opening arguments were fierce. Whitaker's attorneys painted Ethan as a disgruntled executive seeking revenge and Lucy as a naive pawn in his scheme. But Ethan's team was ready. They laid out their case methodically, presenting damning evidence of Whitaker's involvement in the fire, the cover-up, and years of systemic corruption.